on, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. On today's episode, we're joined by a guest, Joseph Solis-Mullen. I pronounced that right. I know I just asked you, but I'm horrible with pronouncing names. I mispronounce Danny's name all the time, and we've been podcasting for 3 years.
You got it.
All right, perfect. Who's a political scientist. And Joseph, you've written some really great stuff, and I've learned a lot about China from you. You wrote this fantastic article on Mises.org called China Won't Be Taking Over the World, which we're going to be talking about among other things. But I just want to lead this off by just giving you my initial take on China, like my very high level take, and you can just kind of take the ball from there and tell me if you agree or disagree or whatever needs further explanation. But in the words of the late Justin Raimondo, I believe China is a paper tiger. However, the narrative out there is, China is on the verge of world domination. And frankly, I just don't think that's true. I think that they have a lot of problems that prevent them from, quote unquote, dominating the rest of the world. Not to say that they aren't a totalitarian government. I just don't think that they're about to, do a beachhead landing on the coast of California. So this so-called threat, this China threat, it just seems like a bunch of hype to me in my eyes. So if you could, I guess, give your general take and kind of just, expand on that, and maybe even just kind of tell us where your knowledge from China comes as well.
Great. So I guess I'll start with the last one first. As a political scientist, I study a lot of different things. I'm actually back in graduate school now doing an economics degree at the University of Missouri. So I tend to throw a wide net, but I read a lot. I usually plow through, 4 or 5 books a week. I read the whole spectrum as far as, I read everything from the Jacobin to the National Review and everything in between. And so anytime something starts coming on the radar, especially the mainstream establishment publications, I'm talking here about things like The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs. Anytime something starts showing up all the time, I just start getting books. Experts and differing experts, because of course I'm not the only one who has a bearish take on China. There's very bullish takes that are very sober. A lot of the stuff that you see in, like, for example, Foreign Affairs, I don't think is very sober. I think it's pretty alarmist, honestly, and that's not confusing, right? Not to be too cynical, but I do think we have to take into account, if I hire you to work for my think tank and your job is to assess threats to U.S. hegemony at the end of this unipolar moment, and you come back and you say, yeah, nothing's really going on. We're in pretty good shape, actually. Okay, thanks, bye, right? We're not going to sell any copy. The military-industrial complex, which, not to get, I know you talk about that on the show, but that's who funds a lot of these think tanks. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, they're not interested in that. They're not going to hire someone to run the think tank if they don't share that same kind of hegemonic, America is the indispensable nation worldview. So on one level, it's not surprising, because you have to have an enemy worthy of justifying the military budget that we have. And I do want to touch on our military budget, because I do think there's a little bit of, public overconfidence, because you see the graphic put around all the time. It gets memed on social media, the U.S. spends more on the military than the next million countries combined, and it's well, that doesn't mean a lot, as audits of the Defense Department have shown. We overpay for a lot of things. Now, I know you guys did an episode on the F-35, so
our favorite plane.
Your favorite plane, I know, because it's
our
just
favorite
phenomenal.
Plane.
It's a world-beating aircraft.
The way I look at it, the more expensive something is, the better it is.
It's got to be
that
way. Yeah.
That's.
Yeah, there was actually a guy who was writing, he wrote a book, Losing Military Supremacy, where he basically broke down just how bad a deal we get. And one of the things that stuck out to me is, he said, if you ever read the copy, the press stuff that they put out, they always use the word sophisticated. it's so sophisticated. And he said, you listen to the dialogue in other military industrial defense circles in like Russia or China, that word is never used. Sophisticated is never used. Efficient is used. Practical, capable, those words are used. But those aren't words that appear when you see them advertising, whatever new toy they have that, has a million different parts that aren't compatible and, need upgrading. And, it's a cash cow, obviously. And that's because there's no serious threat. No one at the Pentagon would actually put up with this if we had a serious threat on the horizon. It would be about what is capable of getting the job done. But we really don't face any existential threats. And so it can just be a raid on the Treasury.
Well, devil's advocate here. What about the idea that people value things more when they're just more expensive, regardless of what the actual inherent value of the thing is? As an example, you might care for a pair of Ray-Bans a hell of a lot more than you would, a cheap $10 pair of sunglasses that you pick up, on a street corner at a vendor or something like that. What if we're just paying more so that we can care more about our stuff?
I think there's something to say for that, but I would just say that in this case, lives are on the line.
Right.
And it's not their money. It's the public's money. If you choose to spend that money on Ray-Bans because you want to signal your status or something, or you just like paying more for stuff, you feel better knowing that you paid a lot more than you needed to for something that could have gotten the job done a lot cheaper. Right. That's a you decision. And I'm fine with that. I don't care. Great. It's your money, but it's not their money. It's not their money, and that's the problem.
That's a fair point.
And lives are on the line.
Yeah, totally.
When you can't eject safely out of an airplane that's going to get shot down if it gets into some kind of dogfight or skirmish, which I know it wasn't designed for dogfighting, so I don't dog on the F-35 too much for that. It's not meant for that. But if for whatever reason the pilot has to eject, even for a mechanical issue, which is probably the more likely scenario, it's going to kill the guy.
Right.
Someone's son or daughter is going to die.
Right.
So Lockheed Martin's share price could get boosted.
Right. No, I'm with you. I'm obviously being facetious. I think that it's almost criminal how much money we spend
with your repertoire. So no, it's funny.
Yeah, but to that point, if you're right, if an F-35 went into a dogfight with, a Russian, why is the name escaping me? What?
Sukhoi.
Yeah, the Russian Sukhoi. That pilot would be dead.
Yeah.
But I think we're getting a little bit...
that's going to happen, but that pilot would be dead.
I think we're getting a little bit off topic. If we could come back to China for a moment, I know that you were just getting through your analysis there.
China is the ultimate boogeyman. They're like a perfect reason to justify spending. You see a lot of the narrative. Right, there's a narrative coming out right now that with the withdrawal from the Middle East and overall, I feel like there is a withdrawal and the Muslim world, at least, Afghanistan and Middle Eastern countries. But, a lot of, since the war on terror is, I guess, essentially kind of like the gig is up, people have found out that this thing is all just cronyism. There needs to be a new enemy. So I guess, why do you think China kind of fits that description so well?
Because it's a relatively powerful country. I mean, it's... I don't know that I agree that it's a paper tiger. I think they have a lot of problems, but certainly they will be a regional hegemon. I don't think that they'll be able to do whatever they want. They're going to have to negotiate with countries like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, Korea, not Taiwan, sorry, Vietnam. Which Taiwan is not a country, right? This podcast won't be aired in China if I say that.
Hey, we don't do the John Cena podcast.
The John Cena podcast, right. What was I saying? I don't know what I was thinking there. No. So, China, up and coming, doing well. I certainly would like the Chinese people to have a good life. I mean, they had an awful century. I mean, when Mao finally, thankfully, departed this world, I mean, that country was just, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. I wouldn't. And so I want the Chinese people to have a good life. Unfortunately, the CCP have certain incentive structures that they face that I think could be problematic. And some of their social engineering experiments have created a population dynamic that I think is probably the strongest case the Hawks have for China being a threat to regional security there. We'll talk about that, of course. But no, China's economy will surpassed the United States. It's more heavily involved with trade than the United States. More countries now, a lot more countries are more trade dependent with China than the United States. And 20 years ago, that just wasn't the case. But there's been a real reversal on that. Actually, Tom Philippin, I think I'm saying his name right. He's a French central banker, but he actually wrote a book called The Great Reversal, where he basically spelled it out for us that the United States has been going full steam away from free markets and world trade for the past 20 years, whereas China has been doing the opposite. And in terms of having to negotiate with their neighbors and not just, go around invading everyone, that's all their supply chains right there. They're heavily, heavily trade reliant with all of those countries. So China, I'm sure we'll talk about Taiwan at some point. But but I just don't see them posing a military threat to, countries like Japan, countries like Indonesia. Obviously, they have border clashes with India up in the mountains. I don't really know what to make of that. I honestly don't spend that much time. A street fight.
They literally hit each other with sticks on the borders.
I mean, that was just brutal.
Yeah.
You're talking about the one where the Indians got killed.
Yeah. Yeah, the ones where they took sticks with, and they started.
Yeah. Yeah, that was brutal, but, So, yeah, I think that China makes a great, and of course, it's the world's largest dictatorship. Mm-hmm. I run in a lot of financial and economic circles, and, everyone talks about it as great emerging market, purchasing power parity, and it's like, let's not forget, this is the world's largest dictatorship here. You will be thrown in prison. They are rounding up ethnic minorities and throwing them in, I don't know, what do you guys call that on your podcast?
Concentration camps?
Vocational camps. They're learning skills.
That's what they call them, vocational camps. But you have to, obey the rules and read the Mao stuff before they'll even train you.
Right.
But, yeah. So, yeah.
Oh, there's so many things to unpack there. Where do we even start?
Well, if you want, I could just really quickly lay out basically kind of the 4 or 5 things. I've got this pretty streamlined now to just kind of lay out what I see as China's fundamental weaknesses.
Sure.
Okay. Because a lot of the alarmism revolves around the fact that China is going to paint Central Asia red. And then they're going to be on the march through the archipelago and into the Pacific Ocean, and the U.S. is going to be boxed out of the region. Don't think that's going to happen, and here's why. So the countries that ring it are all industrial powers, and they have historic grievances against China. I'm talking about primarily Japan, South Korea, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, all those countries. They have no interest in being dominated by China. And I do want to talk about this later in the context of the unipolar moment, but that's one of the reasons I don't think China can play the role that the US has been playing. Because none of them would be cool with China having a base in their country. None of them want China's destroyers, cruising around their shores. They don't want that. Understandably so. Internally, it's got a lot of issues in terms of it's a huge food importer, it's a huge fuel importer, so it can't upset the balance too much because it's so heavily reliant on imports. So, a large-scale war would seriously interrupt that and cause a huge famine, basically. I mean, it would kill a lot of people, and that would totally delegitimize the CCP. Especially if the United States isn't seen as, pushing the CCP. So let's see, demographically, so social engineering wise, the one-child policy. So that created a massive imbalance based on selective sex abortion. They've got, tens of millions of young men who, when the bubble finally bursts, aren't going to be able to find a job or a wife. That's a huge problem. And this is where I think the Hawks have their best case, which is that China is going to need to get rid of some of these people. And so they'll throw them into a conflict with Taiwan. Maybe it'll take a million troops. And Taiwan, I have 5 kids, so bear with me here. I see Taiwan as like a Lego. Have you ever stepped on a Lego?
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. Okay, great. Taiwan is the Lego. And it's on the floor. And China's going to stomp repeatedly on this Lego. And it's going to hurt a lot. But I don't know, eventually the Lego... obviously the Lego isn't Sanctions, so that kind of falls apart there. But you get my idea. Eventually, if they're willing to sacrifice enough people, if the Chinese people are willing to bear those costs, They've got the people to do it. And China recently, a couple of years ago, reversed the one-child policy. And I had a lot of people saying, well, now they're going to even out their population and stuff. And it's like, why would you think that? Why would you think that just because the government says you can have more children now, that people are going to just be like, oh, well, now I'm going to have more children? What other industrializing or industrialized country saw their birth rates go up as they transitioned from an agricultural to an industrial society? The answer is zero. Zero. Because I have 5 kids, and we spent 1 year in an apartment between houses, and it was awful. It was awful. No one wants to raise a bunch of kids in a tiny little apartment in one of China's major industrial hubs. No one wants that. They don't want kids, especially, as you gain more income, high white collar work, like they just have fewer kids. And the Chinese are ordinary human beings. So I don't see them being like, well, the party said I can have more kids, so now I'm just going to have a bunch of kids. No, not at all. If anything, they'll just want to spend more money on themselves, right? Naturally, to raise their standard of living. Let's see. Boy, economically. Okay, so this is where I think a lot of the angst comes from, because China's economy is growing a lot. But let's just keep this in perspective here. GDP wise, sure, purchasing power parity, they passed the United States. Okay, cool. Their GDP is still like $10 trillion, $7 trillion smaller than the United States. And on a per capita basis, China's income per capita by GDP per capita, is $10,000. Okay, the United States is $65,000. They're wildly less efficient. They have 1 billion people still producing way less stuff than the 300 or so million people that we have. And China's total factor productivity has been flatlining for a while. And that's why the CCP is so interested in automation, quantum computing, AI, is they want to get more productive. Understandable. Great. But debt. So markets are great, because markets, when they're working properly, are supposed to weed out bad investments. And I do want to talk about the recession that destroyed the first Bush's re-election campaign, because what that taught everyone was that doing the right thing economically and causing a recession so that things could reset is politically toxic, and now no one will do it. And so the Fed jumps into overdrive mode and pumps the economy full of money, right? The CCP makes, and Scott Horton gave me this line, but the CCP, the Chinese central bank, make the Federal Reserve look like the gold standard of central banking. Citigroup released a report showing that until this past year, when the pandemic caused the Federal Reserve to jump into overdrive again, they were creating 5 times the money supply of the Federal Reserve per month. They were responsible for 80% of all credit creation globally. And a lot of people make a big deal about the fact that China's public debt is really small, I had it written down here, $2 trillion. Okay. But their corporate sector debt, their, quote unquote private sector debt, which we all know that these corporations are just extensions of the Communist Party,
right?
They're in debt way over their heads, to the point that The Economist ran a leader in this week's issue about China's enormous debt debacle that's impending. Their debt to GDP ratio is just under 300%. And over half of it is short-term debt. And if you know anything about debt rollovers, it's very, very sensitive to any changes in interest rate. So the CCP basically can't tighten monetary policy, okay, because it would just cause servicing all of these bad debts, which 3/4 of new loans in China are created simply to pay interest on existing loans. Oh boy.
Yikes.
And so the Belt and Road Initiative, I just want to touch on this real quick, because I wrote an article, I think last year, about it for the Mises Institute, where I said, look, the Belt and Road, really, its most important role right now, because everyone's like, supply chains, domination. It's like, no, what it is you're creating more demand for yuan, for renminbi. And you're creating a market, so you lend them the money, which is a huge problem for a lot of these countries, because they got used to dealing with the United States or the Russians, who just give you dollars or rubles or whatever. The Chinese want this money back, and that's causing problems. It's like a loan. Pakistan's like, a loan? What is a loan? I'm not sure what you mean. Don't you just give me this money? No. And if you don't pay it, we get your port, and no, that's not going to happen. But anyway, so basically, you need a market to dump your overproduction. you need places to shove more of the renminbi. You have to keep creating to keep this bubble going. So that's one of the reasons that I think I wrote another article some time ago about why the yuan wouldn't supplant the dollar. And it's because the CCP doesn't have that on the agenda right now. Because to take the role of the dollar as the central world reserve currency, you'd have to open up your capital accounts, which China has no interest in doing. They tried doing that and then quickly retreated. They want to know where all the yuan are going. They want to have control over who gets them. And that's not how it works. It's on-demand dollars when you want them, however much you want them. And that's it. And China has no interest in that. So right now, I think, the Belt and Road Initiative really serves as a temporary solution to a domestic political and economic crisis that's coming. And I know China bears have been saying for a decade that the bubble's going to pop, the bubble's going to pop. It is going to pop. It just hasn't popped yet. Like, congratulations to them. It's going to be an even bigger crisis when it comes. Like,
just delaying the inevitable.
You're just delaying the inevitable. You're just building a bigger crisis. Like, did you learn nothing? Which is shocking because they were so upset with the United States in 2008. They were so upset. It's like, you're doing the same thing, only worse. Like, you have so many non-performing loans. Like, the low number that I saw for non-performing loans that China is hiding away in its banking system right now is $7 trillion worth of bad loans, non-performing loans. Put this in perspective for you. In 2008, the U.S., when the subprime blew everything up, that was about $1 trillion. That's what $1 trillion in non-performing loans looks like. So $7 trillion. So there you go. This is going to be orders of magnitude bigger. So for me, I conclude my article by arguing that being confrontational with China only will serve to give the CCP a crutch. Because when it all goes to hell in a handbasket, they can point to the U.S. lurking offshore with their carrier strike groups and, waging economic warfare and tariffs and stuff. They're going to be able to say, the Americans did this to us because they don't want China to take its proper place in the global world. They don't want to share the stage with us. And they're right. They're right.
So you're proposing a more laissez-faire approach to China.
The correct answer is do nothing. China is blowing itself. The CCP is blowing itself up. Absolutely.
What didn't Sun Tzu once say? Never get in the way of an enemy who's making a mistake, or never interrupt an enemy who's making a mistake.
I was in high school, but that sounds like something he would say. Absolutely. Yeah. I do that.
That's the art of war.
Yeah.
Well, you know what's funny about this? It's kind of similar to when the U.S. will, like the Cuba protest or Juan Guaido or sanctions on Venezuela. Socialists will be like, well, you know what? The reason why these countries are failing economically is because of the U.S. sanctions. So U.S. sanction kind of serves as a talking point for those economic policies, because then they can go back and say, hey, well, it's not that the economic system is failing. It's because of the U.S. sanctions. It's U.S. foreign policy. That's why we're in this predicament. It has nothing to do with our own policies. So I guess you're saying that this same, if the U.S. does puts more sanctions on China, that they'll use that as a way to justify or to explain the own crises of their own making.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a brilliant point. I hadn't even thought about that, but Putin did the same thing. The Russian economy is struggling because the Americans are applying sanctions and, absolutely. And, the domestic people will say, well, socialism isn't working because the U.S. is just waging economic warfare on these countries. Right. And it's like, yeah, I'm sure they'd be doing a little better, but it wouldn't be a utopia.
And it's not just socialist countries. It's also just anyone. Iran is a good example. North
Korea
exactly.
Is a good Iran's example. A great example.
It only serves, and it's like the whole idea of sanctions. The whole principle behind sanctions is you don't history at all, do you? You really don't. Because if you look at how the West developed, what eventually toppled the old orders was a wealthy and independent middle class. You need to get rich, right? What is it? Right. The hierarchy of needs, right? Mm-hmm. If you don't have a full belly, if you're wondering where your next meal is going to come from, if you're worried about your kids not having access to medicine, you could care less about what kind of government you have. You actually become more reliant on the government to help you.
That's right.
Because you have no one else to help you. So
or the whole idea that
we are just going
to
make these countries so miserable and kill so many people, like Iraq in the 1990s, Like, we're just going to kill so many people that eventually they'll just throw off Saddam, which I think we're going to come back to that, actually, in the context of the unipolar moment, because that's just outrageous. But yeah, but it's just like, and the thing is these are smart people. Like, you look at their credentials, the people who write for these think tanks, the people who write for these publications, like, I know that they know this stuff. And that's why I brought up the incentive structure that they face. If you will not say these things, someone else will.
Right.
Someone else will. And there's a lot of money to be made saying what needs to be said to continue justifying a $1 trillion a year industry. Making war.
It's nuts. Well, I took some notes while you were talking, and you said you've got it down to 4 succinct points, and I want to review them again, and then I want to just like maybe poke into them a little bit more, get a little bit more beef out of it. So you said the first one is what I'm going to classify as a geopolitical issue. That's, all the countries around it don't want China to dominate it. And then you pointed out some internal issues. So like it's a domestic issue, they're a huge food importer, et cetera, and so on and so forth. And then you talk about demographics, talking about like lots of young men and women, mostly men, who need jobs, and somehow they're going to have to figure that part out. And the last one, which you went into great detail on, actually was the economic components of it. Talking about how while they might surpass us in some time for purchasing power, if you run the numbers on the per capita basis, doesn't look so great, not very efficient, and they make the Fed look great. So I want to talk first about that first one. So, you said, all the countries around it are strong industrial powers with no interest in being dominated by China. And you also expounded on the fact that nobody wants China's military assets in their country, right? Very reasonable, thing. So I wonder, on that point, maybe we can talk a little bit about China's military, because I think at least part of the reason why we get a chance to put our bases everywhere is because we are so militarily powerful, or at least have been historically, and that's just how we ended up being. There are other reasons, of course, as well. Sometimes there's mutual symbiosis going on, and honestly, sometimes we just bully them into it. But talking China's military power, some people claim that their traditional military and Navy and Air Force might not be up to spec. We do plenty of episodes on this, doing some comparisons, but one thing that kind of stands out as a potential threat is their missile technology, and the fact that it could put them at a technical or competitive advantage against major military powers in like a conventional warfare setting. How do you think they stack up there in the military, and do you think that they pose any threat to anyone militarily?
Taiwan. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, they pose no threat to the United States.
Oh, naturally.
They pose no threat to the United States. Honestly, I think a lot of it depends on the bellicosity of its neighbors, quite frankly. Japan has been rearming. They've had issues with India historically, 60s, 70s, recently. I mean, it's not as though any of their neighbors are wildly well-armed, top-notch military powers. So it's not like they'd be going toe-to-toe with the United States. Mm-hmm. So, sure. And yeah, in terms of ballistic missile technology, I think that was one of the smartest investments they made. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Why spend $15 billion or however much these, new carriers cost when we saw in the what was the war game that got played where
the Millennium Challenge.
The Millennium Challenge, that's what it was.
Oh,
and the guy
Scott,
who was playing it wasn't Iran, it was like a made up country.
It was Iran, let's be real.
It was a anonymous country in the Persian Gulf.
Right. And what did he do? He literally just fired a bunch. He calculated how many missiles could it possibly intercept. Okay, I'll just fire a few more. Boom, done. Piece of cake. How much do those missiles cost? Fraction what those carriers cost. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Great investment.
No,
it's efficient. Yeah.
It's smart. Yeah, they were able to win with also just like they put some suicide bombs on some boats. And they were they sunk those ships in a couple of minutes. We did a whole episode on this a while back, and I forget the exact how long it took, but it was almost instant.
Literally
it was
called
almost
the Millennium Challenge if
instantly.
You want to check it out.
Yeah, but then they be like, oh, that's not fair. There's rules.
Yeah. they respawn them.
They respawn.
They respawn.
Yeah.
They respawn them like in a game of Halo or something like that. They literally, it's like, oh well, we weren't expecting that, so let's just start over, and then they try to cover it up.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's great. And I mean, their coastline facing the South and East China Sea are stacked with missile batteries. And I mean, yeah, you saw it actually. Goodness, this was a few years ago now, but it was during the Syria conflict. Russia made a missile strike, and the U.S. was just not prepared for the range that it had, and it wound up moving its ships back from where they were in the Gulf. And so I mean, the U.S. military is aware that, like, billions of dollars worth of defense systems, like, all it takes is one getting through and it's over.
Right.
I mean, or even mining.
Moored mines. Well, I mean, you touched on, and you said pretty emphatically that Taiwan is in danger, and you also said on Scott's show that there's a possibility that China might have domestic and political incentives to invade Taiwan. We've actually done an episode on this, and at least personally in my research, it seems that China invading Taiwan is a bit easier said than done from a logistical and a geopolitical standpoint. Do you really think that they would? And if they did, how do you think they'd pull it off?
You know what? I listened to that episode. As I said, I went back and found all your China related episodes. I really love the one about, like, the creation of the Chinese people, which I think is great.
Thanks.
We'll probably talk about that.
Yeah.
Because it's great, because there's so much mythologizing that goes on in the CCP propaganda. But no, look, I think you were spot on in that episode. It is so much easier said than done. But it's really about how much you're willing to bleed for it. Mm-hmm. And if internal CCP polls and stuff are to be believed, they have all of their, media mouthpieces, like, if it's to be believed, like, a very high percent, like, well over 60%, 70% are like, no, we want Taiwan back, and we want it, like, pretty much right now. Like, we've had enough waiting around. It's been how many years since the 3 communiques and the Shanghai, and it's been like 50 years. And Kissinger had said, oh yeah, you'll have Taiwan back in, 30, 40 years. And the CCP is like, okay, we're ready.
It's been 30 to 40, tapping the watch.
And Taiwan's politics have been going in the opposite direction. And at the end of the day, I don't see. I mean, yes, everything you pointed out in that podcast episode. If you want to, like, refresh the listeners on that, you'll do a better job explaining your case to me. But I thought you were spot on. Like, it will cost a lot.
Yeah,
it will cost a lot for all the reasons that you said. But they have the population to expend on it. And the CCP does not care about loss of life.
Yeah, and that's
the population will suffer it. Yeah,
but that's the one point that I know is a strong case to be made for China actually going forward with it. But the TLDR version, or TLDW TLDL too long didn't listen version of the podcast was that the biggest issues around China invading Taiwan is that you'd need thousands and thousands of troops, millions even, and if you in order to do that, you have to stage them all on the beachheads. They'd see them coming for weeks, if not months on end, so Taiwan would be able to prepare for that. Taiwan's already been heavily investing in their military infrastructure, so they already know approximately where these people are going to land, unless they come out of the ground or something like that. They know where they're going to come. They've already armed it up. They're ready to fight. And additionally, even Chinese internal memos say if this takes more than 2 weeks, we're going to lose. We're not going to win. And there's a lot of suspicion that they're not going to be able to make it to last the 2 weeks. And then there's the geopolitical components of it. Like, does the U.S. get involved? Does Japan get involved? Japan definitely doesn't want them to have bases on Taiwan, because that puts them in a militarily precarious position for the South China Sea issues. So there's a lot of factors that are going against them on that. But you're absolutely right. They do have a lot of people, and maybe they can stomach loss of human life a lot more than the U.S.
That would be just one hell of a meat grinder.
Yep.
Like, we're talking about just tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people dying on that.
Lots and lots and lots. Yeah.
And the thing is that's why I point to their domestic political incentives, because the CCP actually knows, because of how I mean, they basically control the corporations. They control the lenders. I mean, it's the relationship is complicated, but that's really not important. They know what is going on in the economy more so than probably any country on earth. So they know what their situation is. And you know that because they've tried taking steps to address things. They've been trying to like game solutions and work things out. And like you just can't stop it. They wanted to stop it. They wanted to deflate the housing bubble. You know, she has been, making a big deal about houses are for living in, not for investing in, and it's like, well, it's already here, And so if they know economic crisis is coming, and it's coming, say in 6 months, they'll know it 6 months ahead probably, or
Brace
whatever.
Brace yourself.
Then they would be looking for a way to rally the country to its cause. And so maybe you'd get some kind of like false flag operation, like, have one of their like literal ships or like, how they violate Taiwan's airspace all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe they could like mock up like one of our jets was shot down by a Taiwanese battery. This is war.
Right.
And like, let's be realistic here. The Chinese people, like, I mean, they're I don't know exactly what.
I mean, shit, we do it too. So let's just put it that way.
We do it too, and our population has way more access to information than them. Like WMD's much. Like, come on, like they could convince the population that like this was an act of war. Japan is not ready for it. Japan's not ready to go toe to toe with China.
Nope.
I've thought a lot about how the rest of the world would react, and that I think is complicated because I look at Russia. And Russia made its moves, and they were prepared. They had socked away a lot of savings from the commodity price boom during the early 2000s. So they knew some sanctions were coming. So they had built up a nice, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of supplies there in terms of money. And they fed it out in terms of like more pensions, more but at the end of the day, there was only so far Germany was willing to go with natural gas on the line. And I look at the rest of the world and it's like, boy, China is China is so much more important to the global economy than Russia. Like orders of magnitude more important.
Right.
And like, how much is Germany willing to rock the boat of that relationship over a territory that the UN does not recognize, and that if you even call it a country or recognize it, China will have nothing to do with you. And they've got it on paper, from a U.S. administration that is theirs. And I really hope the U.S. takes no part in that. Honestly, it would be a disaster. Like, nothing would destroy the credibility of U.S. security guarantees like trying to intervene, I think. I mean, it depends on how far the CCP was willing to go, but...
What's interesting? So back in the day, Gareth Porter came out with this article probably about a month ago. It was from a Daniel Ellsberg leak. And basically the crux was, I forget the exactly what the leak was, but it was something along the lines that the Taiwanese were trying to drag the U.S. into like a false flag to go to war with China. And there was... like the U.S. was considering nuking China at that time. Like that was an option that was presented to Eisenhower. So it's kind of funny that you bring up like the false flag angle. But right now I've kind of agreed. Well, not right now, but over like the past couple of decades, I've kind of agreed with like the U.S. policy of like the strategic ambiguity. That's kind of the term that they use, right? Like we're not going to really just put our cards on the table. We're not going to tell Taiwan, nor we're going to tell China exactly what we're going to do. So both of them are confused, and both of them won't jump the gun and do something stupid. So, like, do you see that policy changing right now, or like, do you really think that the U.S. would actually send troops to Taiwan and risk getting into a possible nuclear war?
I hope not. I really do. I really hope not. I don't know that troops. I was thinking more like a carrier strike.
Not troops, but military assets.
Yeah, military assets, and then again, it comes down to this is part of China, and the UN recognizes that, and so like you're going to intervene in an internal Chinese political military conflict here. boy.
We did it in Ukraine. We do it everywhere. What?
Yeah. Russia is not China, though. Russia, you know, and it was right in Europe's backyard. I don't know. I don't really, I see the comparison. I just don't love it because China is just different. China is different from Russia. And, because I think honestly the Europeans would be fine handling Russia on their own. Like, I'm glad to see Emmanuel Macron taking such a strident lead and saying, like, no, we can take care of ourselves. Europe can take care of itself. And it's like, you know, maybe this is just French hubris, you know, wanting to be like masters of the continent again. And like, I'm fine with that.
Right.
I'm fine with that. It's a huge bill. You know, the United States, whatever you want to say about, you know, global security arrangements, it's incredibly expensive providing that public good. If you consider it a public good, that's how the literature depicts it. Yeah. So, obviously, this is all speculation. I don't know. I really hope that the thing for me is, like, I feel like China is willing to wait so long as domestic political and economic circumstances don't put them in a situation where they need to do something drastic to maintain their legitimacy. So as long as the economic situation is okay and the employment situation is okay, and like when I say okay, like I do think they're in like the midst of several crises here, but they're like, honestly, good for them. They're doing a pretty good job managing it. They're doing a pretty good job managing things. But yeah, that for me is the biggest concern, is that, because otherwise time is totally on their side. Time is totally on their side. They are definitely going to get stronger as time goes on, and I mean, you know, the U.S. is going to get less relatively preponderant. You know, the whole America is in decline and stuff. It's like, we're not in absolute decline. We're even more powerful than we were 50 years ago.
Right.
But in relative terms, things are evening out. Things are evening out. And that's how it has historically been. At the end of World War II, every other industrialized country on Earth was absolutely devastated. So yeah, the U.S. economy accounted for like 50, 60% of all manufacturing output, and, you know, we were kings of the world. And we had a whole generation of people brought up on this feeling, Joe Biden among them.
Right.
And I just worry that they just don't understand that, like, the project of this new of this new century, in my mind, is convincing our national security military establishment that, like, it is nothing like the last one. It's just not. And if the debacles that we have been through in the last 20, 30 years have not shown you that, then I fear for everyone in the world, quite honestly.
Well, talking about debacles for the last 20 years, we can kind of move on to the Afghanistan question, because recently the Taliban had said that they declared China as their strongest
Principal ally or strongest ally.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of that. I don't even know what that really even means, but perhaps you can just talk to us a little bit about the China and Taliban relationship and where you think that might be headed.
Okay, I think this one's pretty straightforward. China, long term, would like some lithium and copper from Afghanistan. They'd like the situation to settle down. They share a very narrow land border with Afghanistan. And right now, they are sending a strong message about Uyghur Muslim terrorists who are in the country. And China is making it clear that, like, okay, look, we're not going to have a problem so long as you kill any of them that you find. And the Taliban is like, okay, this seems reasonable. We can do that. And China's like, okay, then we'll be good. And we'll see how things turn out. And, like, honestly, that's the correct way to play this at this point. Like, it'll be interesting to see what Afghanistan looks like. The first time around, the Taliban didn't control the whole country. You guys know, civil war, right. You know, coups. When they had almost been on the verge of finally taking control of the whole country, sort of, by the time the U.S. rolled in and just blew them away in 2001. So it'll be interesting to see after they consolidate if they're going to be able to manage the state in a responsible and appropriate manner, if they can make the necessary deals internally, that is. So, yeah, because they do have a lot of mineral wealth, but the terrain is, boy.
Impossible might be the word you're looking for. Yeah.
Good word. Impossible. And here's the other thing then. Pakistan. Pakistan is the key here. As always with Afghanistan, Pakistan is the key. Because you're not taking whatever minerals you want out of Afghanistan over land. I've given a lot of thought about this. Like, first of all, you're going to take that stuff all the way to the east coast of China. Like, that's so inefficient. Over land, that's so inefficient. Not to mention, like, any terrorist, any Uyghur terrorist or whoever, one explosion, one explosion. That's all it takes. You can't cover that much rail or pipeline with soldiers all the time, especially when you can just fly a drone packed full of explosives into it. So it's going to have to go down into Pakistan and go over water. Boy, the biggest concern I have for the region right now isn't directly related to Afghanistan, it's Pakistan. Because there's going to probably, there already is, but there's going to be a huge inflow of refugees probably.
Absolutely.
And Pakistan is already really struggling. Boy, that to me is the biggest question right now. Is Pakistan going to be able to keep it together, keep things under control? They're a nuclear-armed state. Oh, boy. It's run by the military, of course. Like, the civilian government is literally just a figurehead. So,
Right.
it's, yeah. So, but yeah, let's talk the Pax Americana, right? Let's talk the unipolar moment and the debacle it has been. Because lately every publication is The Economist is my favorite because they've been doing a whole series about like what went wrong. They're inviting all your favorite hawkish people, like the one
H.R. McMaster's, come on.
Yeah, and they had Kissinger write one, and they had like where they
John Bolton, come on.
John Bolton. No, the first person ABC had was Liz Cheney. Was the first person that ABC had on to talk about Afghanistan was Liz Cheney.
Yeah. Well, her dad did predict exactly what would happen if we went into the Middle East, and he did it anyway. So like, he does have a lot of foresight. Maybe he passed that on to her. Maybe she's got a lot of perspective on how to see that mess.
Maybe
her perspective was as bad as you can possibly imagine. It was just, well, it's our strategic strength is going to be lacking in our allies, and there's terrorists, and the Taliban did on 9/11. Like, just speaking absolute nonsense. But here's something I pulled this from an article from from Quincy Institute. So for the first time since the question was asked in the early 1980s, the Chicago Council of Global Affairs found that most Americans support sending U.S. troops to fight Taiwan if it is attacked. So that's kind of part of the whole narrative that the U.S. is ready to combat China if need be.
I mean, the media is trying to scare them. These publications are trying to scare them. Like, that is what it's for. I mean, you have to convince people that there's a reason they should do this stuff. Like, so they convinced the United States that Afghanistan and Iraq were the reasons we got hit on 9/11. And people were like, yep, it's right. Like, the American people don't have a lot of time on their hands. They get home from work, they flip on the TV, or they flip open their newspaper or their smartphone. They read a few articles, but like, they're not really digging too deep into it. They got a lot going on, I understand. I understand why most people don't know more about these things and are very easily terrified into acquiescence over things that are none of our business. I mean, Taiwan is none of our business. It just isn't.
Yep. Yeah, most people don't want to spend their day running over foreign policy papers and being like, the history of Al-Qaeda, actually, like, most people just don't, and you can't blame them for not having that interest because it doesn't really involve them.
Not at all. They have terrible elites. They have terrible, avaricious, power-hungry elites. Yeah, absolutely. And it's the institutional structure that produces them. Obama wasn't a particularly evil guy, but he did absolutely awful things. Awful things. I mean, he made policy. Obama seems to me like, not a particularly, bad, like, not a bad, terrible guy, but like, he went ahead and made decisions that the institutional structures provided for him that killed, I don't know. How many people have died in Libya and Syria?
Too many.
The estimates are all over the place. It's a lot of people. It's impossible to tell. The world will never really know. But I mean, I suppose in Syria it's probably around 500,000 people at least. Like Syria being probably the biggest war in the 21st century, and then Libya. I mean, Libya is a smaller country than Syria, so Libya is probably, I don't know, 50,000. I mean, Yemen right now is at the very least up to 100,000, and that's very conservative. The Yeah, we're so sorry for empowering Iran by putting a Shiva chauvinist government in place of Saddam.
Yeah, so the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs here just arrived in my mailbox a couple of days ago. Who won the war on terror is the cover. Iran. Iran won the war on terror.
Oh, really?
The end. Yeah, absolutely. The whole idea was we're going to box Iran in, and then we're going to get Iran. And at the end of the day, the U.S. spent, let's see, what did they say? Where is it? I wrote this number down because I just could not. I mean, it was obviously very believable. $6.4 trillion. According to the Office of the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, we spent $6.4 trillion in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Boy. And just made a huge mess of things, right? Far less safe than we were before 9/11. Well, Al-Qaeda before 9/11 was a couple hundred guys. Now there's a bunch of different Al-Qaedas. We funded some of them. Obama actually funded some of them in Syria as part of the I'm so sorry to the Saudi Arabians, right?
Yeah, but but we killed ISIS though.
Oh, right, yeah. After we helped create ISIS to get Iran, to help Saudi, then it got too big, too strong. Then we had to go fight them again and go back to the, Shia militias in Iraq that we realized retrospectively it was a mistake to begin with to be with them. And it's just like, this to me is like, okay, this is why I don't think we should have an interventionist foreign policy. And like, they throw you're an isolationist, like you're some kind of 1930s, you want the Nazis to take over. No, I really am concerned about the fact that the blood of millions and millions of people are on the U.S. government's hands. I'm not going to say the people's hands, although we did elect the government and, pay very little attention and don't hold them accountable for anything. But in our name, in the name of our safety, trillions of dollars were spent killing millions of innocent people. In the name of a strategy that was as stupid as it was short-sighted. Yeah. And Obama didn't make it better. Obama leaned into George Bush's strategy. And he thought he had learned the mistakes of the Bush administration, and he thought, I'll do the opposite thing that Bush did. But just because you do the opposite of what they did because it was wrong doesn't automatically mean doing the opposite is the better solution. Right. They just made the problem worse, and then they reversed course, started doing the opposite of what they were doing,
which
and just made it even more worse.
Right.
We do not, and here's what it is. We are look at a globe, look at a map, look at the United States. Who could possibly ever threaten the homeland?
Aliens.
Okay, aliens. Okay, I'll take aliens. Okay.
Yeah,
but we don't need to be in the Middle East to fight aliens.
Right.
To prepare for the alien invasion.
Right.
Like,
hey, the lizard people are here already, and they're already a threat. So we need to arm ourselves against the lizard people. They shapeshift.
Yeah, I hear you. I'm concerned. We need to spend more.
That's the reason for a tighter surveillance state, too.
Right.
If they shapeshift.
Biometric scanners at everything.
Right.
They should have all of our stuff. Yeah. No, so I look at the United States and it's like, here's the scoop. Your foreign policy, our foreign policy, not ours, our elite's foreign policy is based on either a still unipolar understanding of the world that is just not true anymore. Or this kind of Ian Bremmer described it, who he's a smart guy. I don't agree with everything he writes, but I do think he frames the questions in the correct way, even if I don't agree with all of his conclusions. But a Moneyball style foreign policy that we're just so smart and so clever that we're just gonna pick our spots and get it exactly right, and it's gonna all work out in our favor. No, because we have such a huge margin for error in our foreign policy. We just royally screwed up the Middle East, and we're pretty okay here.
Yep.
Honestly, we're pretty okay. We lost what? How many people did we lose in Iraq in total?
Between servicemen and contractors, 6,000.
Yeah, you can include contractors. Yeah.
Yeah, and then that doesn't include the veteran suicides, which is I'm not even sure what the number is. I think it's somewhere between 30
on the podcast.
Yeah, we just had Matt Ho on our show, and
I listened to that. That was terrible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was terrible. Oh, it was a great podcast, but yeah, the veteran suicides, yeah, it's terrible. But my point is, in 20 years of conflict, I mean, obviously every death is a tragedy, but it's really not that many people. And the military is so cordoned off from most of society. Like, when World War II happened, they drafted you, there was rationing, and you were buying war bonds. You felt that war every single day. The media went months without talking about Afghanistan or Iraq, and we were still there, still spending tons of money. And so for me, I just look at it as, if there are no consequences for making mistakes in foreign policy, you're going to have a bad one. You're going to have a sloppy one. And you're not going to care who it hurts. As long as in the end you can spin it that, like, yeah, this basically worked out okay for us. And you can, like, retrospectively, like, for example, the Vietnam War now, even people like Noam Chomsky will say that, like, actually, strategically, the Vietnam War was a total success. You blew the country apart, killed millions of people. Nobody else in the region wanted to be communist after that. Sure, you didn't achieve your total maximum strategic aim, which was putting your proxy government in the South in charge of the whole country. That would have been the ideal scenario as far as U.S. Military and security planners were concerned. But nobody else in the region had any interest in taking that route after that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is the conservative justification I always hear. Well, if we didn't go into Vietnam, then, more states in Asia would have fell to communism. So we had to teach them a lesson, and it worked.
Yeah, which to me is just wildly immoral. Like,
yeah, it's evil, but they're like, it worked.
Yeah, like, we have no business dictating other countries' foreign policy. Like, just like in Latin America, in Central and South America. I mean, you can rattle them off probably, but like the number of coups, interventions, paramilitary groups that we've fund. I mean, just there's so much blood that was spilled in the name of interfering in domestic political concerns that were none of our business at all. And I honestly think if the American public were, like, sat down and explained, like, word for word, like, look, this is the cost of what this is. This is what it means to be an imperialist. This is what the American empire cost in blood. And you made them read the accounts of babies getting cut out of women. I don't think that the American people would stomach it for a minute. I don't. Because most people are, like, pretty good, decent human beings. But the costs of empire are hidden from them.
Hidden
well,
costs.
I used to be all about this stuff. I mean, when I was younger, I was 7th grade when 9/11 happened. All throughout my teenage years, I was like, yeah, this is great. This is like, they all deserve it. This is a revenge that is justified from American foreign policy. These guys all were responsible for 9/11. Then I grew up and realized that, the ideas that you have, for the most part, when you're a teenager are really, really stupid. And when I started actually reading accounts of just numbers, really, like I saw body tallies, like, wow, that many people died due to this war. I think that number alone is enough to change someone's perspective, because that was certainly one of the things that changed my perspective. But going back to China, and I'm going to try to tie this back in, because when it comes to, like, communism, I feel like that in the case of China, when, Mao's strategy to, kind of concentrate on the countryside to, enforce or get his Marxist communist plan going, concentrating, shifting his plan from, like, labor unions to, like, country peasants. And then, like, Vietnam in the same kind of spirit, I think most of these people who are not ideologically driven, they kind of just see communism as a plan that means, like, sharing the wealth, and it's also anti-imperialism. So I think that actually drove a lot of these countries to communism, just, colonialism in general, not necessarily because they were reading Marx.
Absolutely. I mean, communism got intertwined with anti-colonialism and economic nationalism. You're absolutely right. And, all of it wasn't a hegemonic block of, like, communism. There was a lot of difference, and from party to party, state to state. And, some of them were very Marxist, some of them were Stalinist. Mao was a Stalinist, Leninist, and then Maoism became its own thing. But yeah, and it is understandable. I mean, like, look what happened in Iran. Why is Iran the big bad guy, right? Because Mossadegh wanted to use the oil that Iran had to help the people of Iran instead of enriching Western oil companies. And that was just totally unacceptable. So, like, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. If in your mind, communism, socialism is wrapped up in, like, anti-imperialism, like, sure, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. Like, we're working so hard and all the wealth is getting sucked away to some other part of the world. And there's just a few obvious puppets on top of this who are, you know, oppressing us and, you know, getting rich themselves. Yeah, it makes absolutely perfect sense. Yeah, I would have been a communist if I had been one of those countries.
Well, unfortunately, with the outcome of that, a lot of folks out there that listen that might be of the communist persuasion might be saying that, oh, real communism hasn't been tried yet. Barring that, putting that aside, you know, a country like China, which we're talking,
we get that a lot
about. Yeah, we really do.
Yeah, I get that a lot. And I honestly, sometimes like real communism they'll get, people will get, because we have a pretty diverse, you know, we have an anti-war message for the most part, and you know, we have like a mix of libertarians and a lot of progressive leftists listen to this as well. So, you know, sometimes
we get
you'll
everything.
get kind of like, you're not given like you're just using talking points when describing socialism, or you know, you're just you're not really explaining what socialism is, and you're just you know, sticking to your capitalist.
I don't even know what that stuff means, because socialism is such a diverse ideology.
I know,
and
exactly.
there's so many different kinds.
Yeah.
Like, you're not talking about socialism. It's like, what are you talking about? What kind of socialism do you want to hear me talk about?
Right.
You want to hear me talk about some anarcho-syndicalism?
Right.
You want me talk about state socialism? What do you want to hear me talk about? You know what I mean? And a lot of times they're like,
you know, socialism.
You know, the good socialism,
you know,
the good
Che.
kind.
Come.
yeah, right?
Or they'll use Che, or like, you know, like Denmark. Denmark's not socialist.
Anyway, going back to China. So the outcome of a lot of these socialist or communist projects often doesn't pan out in the way that would be helpful, or in the way that the people who, you know, you said yourself, hey, I'd be down for communism if I was put in that position. You know, for a lot of the people who were down for communism in that moment, it didn't necessarily pan out super well for everyone. Some of the stats that you brought up earlier were, you know, the GDP spread. So there's obviously a bunch of wealth disparity, right? They have a ton of money, right? But if you organize it across, you know, all of the, you know, people per capita, it's like 10K versus our 65K. And that's just what they report, right? Exactly. That's just what they're reporting. So there's obviously poverty, right? There's obviously food issues. I know that you wrote in your article on a per capita basis that China has less arable agricultural land than Saudi Arabia, which obviously means they need to import a shit ton of their own food, or heavily process, like chemically, you know, all of their food stuff. So there's poverty, monetary poverty, there's food poverty, there's income inequality, the whole range of issues that affect, at this point, potentially billions of people in China, right? Because they have, you know, a lot, well, not billions, millions of people. So I'm wondering a bit about, you know, you also wrote in your article that the CCP faces multiple permanent secessionist dangers far from its core. And I'm wondering if the kind of failures of communism in China is driving any serious secessionist movements in China. So who might they be if that's the case? And, you know, what's up with that?
Okay, perfect. So let's distinguish then. When China started to succeed was when they moved away from Maoism, when they moved away from communism, and they embraced a form of state. Really, it was like state capitalism. State socialism, you know, the lines are blurred. I guess it'd probably be better to call it state socialism. But, you know, private ownership started to proliferate. They started to loosen things up, liberalize. That was the Deng era, right? And Hu Jintao and all of that through the 90s, joining the WTO, making a lot of the right decisions. But it wasn't a smooth road in terms of security, in terms of the CCP. Because the CCP elites don't care. I don't see any reason to think they care more about the average Chinese person than their position. I don't know that there's any reason to think any elite anywhere values the life, the well-being of the average person more than their position of power that they have worked their whole life to obtain, and that, you know, especially in China, you know, losing your position of power in China, that's not like, getting voted out of office here probably, right? This could get messy. Not sure what would happen, right? Not entirely clear. So China started to succeed precisely when it moved away from communism. And it's a complicated situation because a lot of people see Xi Jinping as moving them back towards the past and more towards, central state control. He didn't, I don't think, based on my reading, I've read, a couple dozen books on China, bulls and bears both, but I think it was George Magnus made the point that when he first came to office, Xi wanted to keep going with the liberalizing reforms, but that a combination of crises, some of which I touched on in here, made it so that he kind of had to go the way he's going. And like he keeps trying different things. So like I really, I give him a lot of credit. I mean, if you have to have a, dictator, he's not the worst you could do in terms of like managing things, I guess. Yeah. I don't know how much of a plaudit that is. Like if you have to have a dictator, I mean, he's not the worst you could do. He's very aware. He's very active. He understands. Like, for example, you talked about wealth inequality. The eastern part of the country is so much wealthier than the western part of the country. This is obvious, right? It's a coastal region. This is where all the economic activity is. People want to go there, right? Well, in China, there was their welfare system, the hukou system, was very poorly originally set up. If you left your home province, you got cut off from the social security net. So if you, and we know labor mobility is so important to developing a dynamic economy. But if you're like, okay, let's say, you've got medical care and, a few other benefits. So, but you got basically no economic prospects here. So you can leave and try and get a job somewhere else. But now, whatever extra money you're making there, you're going to have to sock away in order to pay out of pocket for, let's say, medical or, whatever it is, right? All the things that you've sacrificed. And so they've been trying to reform that. But the problem is these systems are managed by local authorities. And Xi Jinping is not all powerful. He has to make compromise. He has to make deals within the party, within the wider bureaucracy, with local government officials. Local government officials don't want to be paying more benefits to more migrant workers. They'd love for them to come. That'd be great. But no, we don't actually want to like pay your benefits and stuff. And they've made efforts to reform that, and it's been a back and forth process. But that's just one of those examples where, it's not all cut and dry. It's very uneven, just like liberalizing currency reforms, all that stuff. Xi has been, it's hard to keep up with everything because he tries so many different things. And there's a lot going on, and China's huge. The economy has a lot of moving parts. They have their own shadow banking system, which is a whole other thing.
Right.
So
are there specific like elements or regions or groups of people that are looking to secede?
Absolutely. Sorry, yeah. Let me see here. Let me flip through my notes here because I had written that down somewhere here. Well, whatever. I'll just tell you. Obviously, the Tibetan problem. I'm just going to phrase these in the manner of problems. I'm the CCP leadership. This is a problem. Tibetans, Uyghurs, Sichuanese, Shanghai, all problems. Hong Kong, problem. These are all problems, right? These are all potential secessionist problems for different reasons. The first two are ethno-religious problems. Right? That's why you've got to lock them up in vocational schools and brainwash them.
Right.
On the other side, you've got all these economic and tech elites who don't want anything to do with Western and Central China. They want to be engaging more with South Korea, with Japan, with the United States, with Europe, because that's where the money is, right? And that's why the whole tech sector crackdown. Now, this started a year and a half ago when Jack Ma opened his mouth inexplicably. I couldn't even believe he did this. He criticized the Chinese Communist Party's tech regulation policy. And it was like, oh boy, this is not going to turn out well. And since then, it has been a war on the tech sector. And it's not about regulation. Like I get these like bulletins like, we're monitoring China's regulatory crackdown for potential portfolio issues. And, we'll keep you informed. It's like, it has nothing to do with any of that. It has to do with showing these coastal economic elites who's really in charge. That's it.
Is that why they did the video game lockdown where the kids can't play video games, but for more than 3 hours a week?
3 hours a week.
I don't know that. I mean, I'm not sure how much that'll hit the pocketbook of the tech sector. It probably will.
A bunch of stocks did drop like 6%, like a lot of them. A lot of stocks
Yeah,
dropped.
there are a lot of them. Yeah, definitely, and it could be. But I also think part of it is, the CCP likes controlling people's lives, and they have a vision for how the country should be. And she is like a 60-year-old man. How many 60-year-old men do you know who are like, yeah, kids should be playing lots of video games? Like, how many 60-year-old men do you know who are like, if they could, they would erase video games from history, right?
Well, it's spiritual
She's in a
opium.
position,
That's what they call it.
and she's in a position where you can do that. So, yeah.
I mean, he's definitely probably just looking at it like, why are all these kids addicted to? I mean, the wording was spiritual opium.
Yep.
That was the wording.
The exact
Absolutely.
words.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's tried to create this whole mythology about who China was and is, and the century of humiliations turned us into, this oppressed people who can't raise their heads up, and, it's time for us to take our place and realize who we are and reconnect with what real China is, and like.
And it starts by stopping playing video games.
What's real China though? Because I guess the myth for a lot of people is that China has always been some unitary state, but China as a unitary state, as we know it, is the exception, not the rule. Like a lot of Chinese history that has always been broken out into warring states. Like after in the early 1920s, it was ran by warlords, or early 1910s, like their warlord period. Whatever.
I mean, they've had several.
That's
They had like the Warring States period. They had the multiple emperors period. I mean, no, I'm pulling up the actual ones. I want to give you the actual correct. Let me see. Okay, so like China, air quotes here. Approximately 2,000 years old, approximately. But really, only 300 of those years were the borders of today's China more or less what they were and controlled by a Han-dominated government.
Right.
So 300 years, and they weren't contiguous. So
it's 15% of the time. It's nothing.
It's not big. Like, you need to do some serious mythologizing, and the CCP does a great job of it. A great job. They do these big, celebrations, and I don't know if you guys saw the celebration they did this last year, but they had all these great performances about China's history, and it's phenomenal myth making, and that's important. I think the loss of a unifying myth has been really detrimental to American political order, quite honestly.
I'm still waiting for the myth of the human race as a thing, so that we can all unify under that when we need to fight the aliens.
Yeah, we'll need to. Because if they can, do interstellar travel, they're gonna liquefy us in an instant.
Yeah, totally.
You know what it kind of reminds me of, or makes me think of? So, it kind of makes me think of like Japanese nationalism. Like, you think that you could compare like Japanese nationalism, not now, like Japanese nationalism in like the 1920s and 1930s. Is that kind of like the process that they're doing? Because it seems like they're going through like the nation state building process, but like what I like to say is that they're building a nation state with a blunt hammer in broad daylight. Yeah, I coined that. I didn't steal that from anyone, by the way. But yeah, I was very proud of myself. Like, they're building a nation state, but
Henry from Bro History once said that
subconsciously,
China
maybe
is.
I did. If that comes up and I read that subconsciously, that I made that I took it subconsciously, I'd be so disappointed. Someone will definitely be like, "Oh, you took it from this book." I'm like,
they're not really doing much of anything that other nation states didn't do.
yeah,
The only difference is France killed all its, other ethnic, competitors, 1,500 years ago. Right. Like, that's why the Franks had France. Like, they drove off all of the other competitors, and then, started developing societies, and. So, yeah, I mean, they're doing it in broad daylight, they're doing it in real time, and in the age of the internet, where we can all see what they're doing, and it's not an exceptional process. Like, state building is pretty horrific. I mean, we don't have time to go into like how the American state was built, but like it was bloody.
Yeah.
It was bloody. You know, it's a settler colonial nation state. Like, it just is what it is. So
yeah, I mean, especially ones, yeah, like the ones, this nation state that take like this kind of I don't know, would you say that they take like an ethnic identity, like a Han ethnic identity in their nation state building? Because you can see that in like early 1920s or not early 1920s, before that, like Serbia, for example, and pre-World War One, they were kind of a nasty kind of ethnic nation state that was very belligerent, like coming right out of the being a province of the Ottoman Empire. And they really thought that all this surrounding land, the phrase they used was any place where a Serb was Serbia, or I think they used like maybe an Orthodox church. Forget the exact phrasing of that, but I mean, their nationalist movements were very, very hyper. So do you think that they kind of like China has like kind of like this Han-centric type ethnic nationalism character to it?
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, they won't even acknowledge that Sichuanese is a separate language, even though no linguist would ever say that it wasn't. Yeah, it's easier to build a nation state that way when you have one dominant ethno-religious group. And the Serbs, they weren't unique. I mean, that was the Wilsonian vision. And it was just a carryover of the spirit that dominated the 19th century in Europe. Self-determination for ethno-linguistic and religious states. So there was a little bit more tolerance by that point in terms of like religious minorities. We weren't in full Reformation, 30 Years War type stuff. But yeah.
And it seems like a lot of the clashes between like the Han Chinese and like Uyghurs, have been just like full out kind of just race riots or race fights.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know what to say to that. I mean, the CCP have the power to do what they want. The Uyghurs try to resist. That is very admirable. I would certainly, if I were in their position as well. But at the end of the day, whether or not Thucydides meant us to take this as a statement of realpolitik or, sort of a moralizing lesson, the strong do what they will and the weak will suffer what they must. And that,
point.
if we're going
Fair
to
point.
do what? Sorry, Danny, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, I was just going to say fair point. Fair point.
Yeah, and what are we going to do? What are we supposed to do something every time? Tibetan, I would never support the Chinese policies toward the Tibetans or the Uyghurs, but that doesn't mean that I want to live in a fiscal, military, imperialist state devoted to trying to intervene all over the world and just making a total mess of things. And that's why I want the myth of U.S. grand strategy to just die. Like, even in the unipolar moment, we made such a horrifying mess of things. Maybe that's the good thing that China, maybe it would be good if China were really, really strong and, U.S. elites needed to focus really hard on making good foreign policy decisions. I don't know. Because during the unipolar moment, it was just mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I wanted to touch on this really quickly because I know you guys devote some of your time to this. But there's been this effort to really lionize the first Bush ever since W left office. I mean, you can find it in like really progressive, like Simon Reed Henry. He's a historian. He wrote a book called Empire of Democracy in the last couple of years. Richard Haas, and he worked for Bush. Ben Rhodes, who him. Just this attempt to be back in the good old days, we had very intelligent foreign policy. Like when Bush Sr. was in office, and it's like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? The thing is, if you say it often enough and you say it loud enough, it's true. For all intents and purposes, it's just true. And people will act on the basis of believing it's true. And all these BS articles about we've learned a lot from Afghanistan and Iraq, and now, see, next time we won't do this, and now we know to do that. And it's even if I believed you actually learned these lessons, you'll make the same mistakes or totally new ones in a new situation. Because your attention span is so short. Like, you had barely even started the Afghanistan intervention before it was like, oh, more war. Can we go to Iraq now? Can we go to Syria?
Yeah.
Like, you haven't even finished your first war, you know? Like, come on. You have no idea what's going on. And you don't care. Not you personally, but, like, they don't care.
Right.
They don't have to care. Unless, you know, people make them care. And so if you have a public discourse that says, once our interventions were very smart, like the first Iraq war, that was genius. And it's like, yes, it really was genius how we helped Saddam into power and then, created an oppressive state in Iran and then encouraged him to go fight Iran in like a World War I style death match. And then encouraged him to solve the Kuwaiti problem on his own, and then changed our minds and booted him out and starved 500,000 children to death in Iraq because we couldn't make up our mind about what we wanted to do with Saddam. Because first Bush encourages the Shia and the Kurds to rise up against Saddam, but then changes his mind because he realizes, oh, wait a minute, those are the Iranians' friends. Oh, wait, don't want to do that. You know what, we'll just leave it on simmer. We'll just let it sit here.
Leave it on simmer.
We'll just leave it on simmer, and then Clinton,
they were smarter than Bush the
Kosovo
elder.
and Bosnia. It's
Bush is
myth
younger.
after myth after myth, and it's just, I just feel like, I just feel like most Americans are decent human beings, and that they would not stomach the kind of adventurism and interventionism abroad that our government, that our national security establishment, and that our military industrial complex, that these institutions will continue to just churn out. And maybe for the time being, like Vietnam, the U.S. public won't want to put troops on the ground anywhere else. That is not going to stop them for an instant. Funding proxies, selling weapons, and that's all on us. That's all on us. Because we do nothing to stop them. Yep. And other countries, they look at us and they're like, wait, don't they elect their government? Oh, well, they must be okay with this stuff. So
doesn't China use that as a club? Whenever we criticize China, they're like, well, at least we don't invade other countries and kill people.
Destroys our credibility. It destroys our credibility. We try and criticize Russia for something, and Russia just has a whole laundry list of stuff that they can list off.
Putin's like, you fund ISIS. You create ISIS. You create ISIS. See how they don't bomb these trucks? They're ISIS. They bomb,
And he's right. He's right. We're literally, not, I don't know if it's, explicitly, on purpose. I don't know that anyone would ever put this down on paper, but, the fact that we have this little area cordoned off right here is preventing the final defeat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Iraq forces in the Middle East, just because we don't want, Iranian influence and stuff like that. And it's just what is going on here? Why? We needed to go after Assad to get Iran, And it's what did Iran ever do to the United States? But if you ask the average American and they're like, oh, Iran's very dangerous. Big threat. Oh, yeah. And it's if I were Iran, I would want nukes.
They do.
Well, basically, if you're talking to a war hawk or a very anti-Iran person, they're going to list them off all right, come on, there's Khobar Towers, which is debatable. We don't.
That wasn't Iran.
I know, but they'll use Khobar Towers. They'll use Khobar Towers, and then they'll basically use any Shia who killed an American in Lebanon. Well, that was all Iran.
But
then
Israel shouldn't have created Hamas and, invaded Lebanon and got Hezbollah created and stuff Bin Laden was explicit, and about why he did what he did. And apart from, stationing troops in Saudi Arabia to keep antagonizing and torturing the Iraqi people following the first Gulf War, it was support for just carte blanche support for Israel's policies in the Middle East. That's right. Literally bombing a UN camp full of women and children. Are you kidding me? Of course China doesn't listen to us. Just like they won't listen. Let's say they invade Taiwan and the U.S. says, oh, but wait a minute. The UN says you're not supposed to do that. And they're going to be like, oh, right. Because you asked the UN before you went into Iraq, right? Oh, right. Good. So can it?
Cool.
They've got no interest. We have no moral authority because of these policies. And there's no reason for it. It doesn't make us safer. Terrorist attacks have gone magnitudes of orders higher. Far more terrorists now than before the war on terror, obviously.
But Joseph, I listened to this interview a while back, and it was Mike Pompeo, and his conviction about how much he cares about the Muslims in Xinjiang in northwestern China. I don't know, something about him. I trusted him.
I do too. Yeah, I believe
There's something
him too.
about him. I trust him.
When they're in China. Yeah, when they're in China. Yeah. And that's
When they're in China, they're
when they're
so
in
funny.
China, those people's lives are precious. How dare you? How dare you? And it just rings so hollow to the rest of the world. But my real concern is that they're manufacturing anti-Chinese sentiment. Like, you can literally look at the public polling data. Like, increasingly, like over 60% of Americans hold unfavorable views of China, are increasingly okay with fighting for Taiwan against China, even though they couldn't explain even the barest minimum of the history there.
Yep.
Because they've gotten
you know,
convinced that, like, U.S. credibility is on the line. And it's like, we never agreed to protect them. Like, Carter threw that out, and the new Taiwan Act was purposely, like you said, strategic ambiguity. But now we're pursuing this policy. I love the euphemisms that they use. The obfuscating language. Now we're going to engage in strategic engagement with China. This is just a euphemism for saying we would love to just make you do what we want, but we can't. So there are certain things we just have to deal with you on. Like, that's all that means.
Right.
Like, they're setting up a new containment strategy. The first thing Biden's foreign policy team did when they got into office in their Defense Department was head straight to East Asia and visit India, South Korea, Malaysia, Japan, the Philippines. Remember the Philippines? Duterte was making the big deal about, like, I'm not the Americans, Patsy, and you're going to get out of my country and stuff. Like, foreign policy just had a piece a couple weeks ago where it's like under the table, they're just like, but, this doesn't really change anything. You understand? This is just like domestic politics. You understand. Like, of course.
I just have to
He doesn't
say
want
that.
the U.S. going anywhere. Of course not. It's very expensive to have a massive navy that can actually stand up to someone. Yeah, they don't want them going anywhere. So it's terrible. But I started off. I don't know if we were live yet, but I started off by saying that I really feel like we're at a moment right now where there's enough support there's an openness that in my lifetime I've never experienced to, like, talking about the isolationist position, like on the left and the right. Like, should we be doing any of this stuff? And of course the hawkish establishment is like churning out the stuff to, like, make us terrified and, like, think we need to, like, go save the world because we are the what do they call it? The indispensable nation. That's what they call it, the indispensable nation. No one can provide the public goods we provide. And I don't know, I really think the costs. John Kerry one time said when he came back from Vietnam, like, how can you ask someone to have their son or daughter be the last person who dies for a mistake?
Right.
And I really hope that Afghanistan and Iraq are seared into the public consciousness.
Well, here's
Because
the thing.
these didn't have to happen.
The media has already kind of rewritten the narrative, because now all of the history of the war in Afghanistan, it all boils down to the month of August and September. Like, it all boils down to the month of August, and Biden came in, and man, the CNN and most mainstream presses, they basically, you felt like they were part of the Biden administration until he pulls out of Afghanistan, until he makes do. And honestly, the withdrawal was a shit show. There were, obviously, it was very ugly looking, but you would have thought that we were winning the war, and then all of a sudden Biden came in and just ruined it, the way that it's being covering.
Yeah, I was reading in the Wall Street Journal that they were saying, like, oh, well, this is just a piece of cake. All we need to do is carry on doing surgical strikes, and all it's going to take to solve this problem is to do a few surgical strikes, few special operations, and it'll all be cleared up. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, this is a legitimate piece that was published in one of the pillars of the American media. Like, what do you think we've been doing for the last 8 years? Like, it'll always just be one more. It'll always just be one more. And I just look at East Asia. Those countries are going to be just fine. China is not going to lord it over them. Central Asia, there's nothing they really want there except, just access to materials. They'll run the Belt and Road. They'll run their, new Silk Road through there. It'll cost a ton of money. Probably it'll be targeted by, some kind of terrorist attack at some point. There'll be hitches. It'll work okay. It's not as efficient as obviously using shipping. It's just way cheaper to ship things over water. But, as far as like expanding beyond the South and East China Sea, like that won't happen.
Well, after watching us do it for 20 years, or I mean, much longer than that, they'd have to be really stupid to want to engage an empire.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the Kindleberger trap, right? We're declining, right? Or we don't want to, provide the public goods anymore. And China doesn't want to do it either, right? Nobody wants to do that. It's expensive and terrible. Like nobody wants to provide these services. If you want to call them services, that's again just how they're referred to in the literature. But yeah, and so I don't know. We're definitely I do know what you mean with the media trying to like rewrite things, but Trump literally came in and like just rewrote the platform of one of the major political American parties. Like Bernie Sanders, if he had his things together, like 2016 when he ran, 2015, he was not prepared. He just wasn't prepared. He didn't think he was going to be in the game. And like all of a sudden he was in the game, and the DNC was sabotaging him behind the scenes and stuff. And like if he had been ready to play and ready to go, who knows how that would have turned out. Like the establishment's credibility after the wars in the Middle East, after the economic crisis, the sluggish recovery. I definitely think there's a willingness now to talk seriously. I mean, Ian Bremmer, who is certainly not an isolationist, he wrote a book basically outlining the choice, saying like, isolationism, it's not the option I would choose. He's kind of more of an indispensable power guy, but he's like, the case for isolationism isn't dumb. It's actually funny because like there's like a lot of like economic modeling that goes into like trade and stuff, but the bigger a country is, the more it produces and stuff, like the less overall it gains from trade. So like smaller countries gain a ton from trade, but the bigger you are, actually the less you gain from trade. The marginal returns on trade are smaller. So like, we've got plenty of liquefied natural gas, lots of oil. We get most of our stuff from Canada and Mexico anyway. We've got a relatively young population. I can see it. I can see it. Like I'm a free trader myself, but I can see it. I think it makes sense. It's a choice. It's a choice. And it reminds me of that Orwell essay, Shooting an Elephant, where he's an imperial policeman in Burma. And he comes to realize as he's confronted with this obligation because of the role that he is in as an imperial tool, as an extension, as a representation of the British Empire, that he is actually a slave himself. And we can choose not to be tools. Like,
choose not to be a tool.
we choose not. It is an option. Like, obviously, like the F-35. Like, we're dealing with smart people. They spread the jobs out all over the country, so your rep won't vote against me. Bernie Sanders voted for the program.
Right.
Well, I don't want those jobs to leave Vermont.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it's tough.
Those are good, high-paying jobs,
Yeah, exactly.
It's going to be built somewhere else.
Manufacturing jobs. Yeah. So these are smart people. These are smart people. They have a lot of money. There's a lot to lose. That's actually, I thought, like, the best way to destroy the military-industrial complex, because I'm an Austrian, would be to go back on the gold standard. Think about it. You've got no elasticity in your money supply. Think about it. World War I comes. We suspend the gold standard. World War II comes. Suspend the gold standard. Vietnam and the welfare state had to get rid of it entirely. Like, if you went back on the gold standard, you couldn't afford the military-industrial complex. Not by a long shot.
Good luck with that. Good luck.
Yeah, we just did a podcast on talking about Germany during World War I and all their spending and all their inflation and what eventually led to hyperinflation. It's all made possible with just the printing press.
Hey,
making digital dollars.
So we're coming up on well over an hour and a half, and I don't want to take up all your time, Joseph. I feel like we could sit here and talk for literally hours, and I hope that you can become a regular on the show because I value your opinions. I have one last question about China, and then I want to give you an opportunity to plug anything that you want to plug or whatever you like. And I wanted to talk just real quickly about tech because tech is the future. And, in our conversation here, we've been talking about some constraints that China has with their productivity, specifically economic productivity. But as you pointed out yourself, China's been heavily investing in AI, quantum computing, space, alternate energy, you name it. So I'm wondering, do you think any of these developments could change the geopolitical calculus if they're able to get a considerable lead on any of these technologies? So going back to the entire conversation about how we think, China's not really going to take over the world. Let's say they invent fusion energy or something crazy like that, right? How does that change your mind? Or does it at all?
Okay. So, all right, let's say they create general AI or fusion technology, or they master space-based solar electrical power. Okay, sure. That would change the calculation. Sure. Because then they have something everyone else needs. Sure. But for me, I always ask myself, who would I bet on? A centrally controlled state that is basically micromanaging the tech sector, who won't let them experiment and do whatever they want. Which certainly, it's not like in the United States they let them do whatever they want, but it's been kind of a Wild West, the tech era has in the United States. And look at all the great stuff we've got. China stole all that stuff or bought it, by using agreements with American firms. They didn't. China has started generating some patents over the last few years, granted, but I just ask myself, is a free, dynamic, liberal capitalist society going to make these inventions, or is a state socialist monopoly going to produce these technologies? And I think probably from the way I phrased the question, you can guess my answer. I would bet on human freedom, creativity.
Okay.
Well, Al Gore created the internet.
It's a system of tubes, if you didn't know.
Well, that was private when he did that.
Well, this
all right. Yes, of course, the U.S. military did do GPS and started the internet and stuff. Yeah, but we have the basic tech already.
Right.
And our tech sector is full of capital. We have more capital in our system than we know what to do. There's just tons of capital just sitting around. And investors are like, what should I do with this? I don't know. Should we just burn it? I don't know. We could just light our cigars with it. Or maybe we could try just filling up a Tesla, see how many $100 bills we could fit in there. We're ready. We're ready. So the future is, I think, bright for our tech sector, as long as the government doesn't get really involved in strangling it. So
fair enough. Well, this has been absolutely awesome. Henry, do you have any other questions?
Yeah. No, man. Plug your stuff. Where can we find your work? Where can everyone who's listening find your stuff? Where you write? Just plug whatever you need. You want to plug.
Oh, great. Thanks. Well, I do a lot of my writing for the Mises Institute. I publish working papers on Sage Advance, which is just a preprint site, because the peer review process takes a really long time. So I also put stuff on my website, jsmwritings.com. I started blogging a while ago. I'm terrible about blogging, though, because anytime I sit down, I have an idea in my head, and I want to do it right. And when I do that, then, I usually send it out to some publication somewhere. So my blog is pretty scant. It's probably only 10 listings there. But I'm really trying to put more stuff on there. Maybe I'll do some more commentary stuff. But no, what I would ask your listeners to do is to really think about the things we talked about today and ask themselves whether or not they want to be a part of what's going on, and to seriously call your reps, call your senators. They, believe it or not, even though there's plenty of studies that say U.S. public opinion has no impact, it's really the only chance you've got, in terms of getting in their ear, telling them you're not okay with this kind of stuff. You just have to, just got to do it. So, or not. I'm a libertarian, so do it, don't do it, it's your choice.
Love it.
All right, Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today.
Danny, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it. I've had a great time talking to you.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun. We definitely want you on. Is if you ever want to just brainstorm, if you're writing something and you just want to kind of
talk
about it and just kind of get the ideas out here, feel free to use our show to do that, because this has been really fun and very valuable. Danny, anything else before we wrap this one up?
No, man. Thanks again, Joseph.
All right. Everyone who's listening to this show, rate and review the podcast. That is the number one way to help support this show, is by rating and reviewing it. And then you can also support us on Patreon as well. But thanks, everyone. We love you, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.
Peace.